Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and He Lied inside the church, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Confession came before the murder. The priest's throat was slit moments after he whispered, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." And no one ever saw who walked out of the confessional. It was a Thursday, just past 7, when the rain came down like the sky wanted to erase something. In the dim light of St. Anselm's Church, silence folded over the pews like linen at a funeral. Father Brown, always the last to leave, was lighting a candle for the soul of a boy who drowned the year before, when he heard the sound that didn't belong. Not the crackle of wax or the hush of holy air, but the unmistakable scrape of wood. The confessional door. Someone had entered, but no one had walked in. He turned calmly, as he always did when the world turned strange, and noticed the flickering shadow through the velvet curtain. The figure inside didn't speak for nearly a minute. When he finally did, his voice wasn't tremulous or afraid. It was calm, controlled, as if confessing was not penance, but strategy. "I have committed a terrible sin," the man said, "but not the one they think, and before this night ends, I will no longer be among the living." Father Brown felt it then, a stillness that wasn't peace, but something sharpened, like the world had taken in a breath and refused to let it go. He waited, said nothing, as the man went on. "Everyone believes she died. By accident," he whispered. "They were wrong, and what I did next, they'll never forgive." There was no name, no details, just those few cryptic lines. And then silence. Not the kind that waits for an answer, the kind that finalizes one. Father Brown pulled the curtain aside just as the bell in the church tower tolled once, and the booth was empty. He reported it to no one. Not yet. Something was wrong. Something deeper than the absence of a body or the presence of a lie. It was in the way the candle near the altar sputtered when it shouldn't have. In the way the heavy doors remained locked from the inside, yet footprints, wet, deliberate, led away from the booth. The next morning, they found the priest, Father Mallory. His body was discovered slumped inside the same booth, blood pooling at his feet, the red soaked into the grain of the old wood. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. His expression, frozen in death, looked peaceful, almost as if he knew what was coming. Father Brown said nothing, as the police swarmed. He only stared at the edge of the booth, where the blood hadn't reached. A single object had been placed on the floor beneath the kneeler, a folded handkerchief. Embroidered into its corner, in pale blue thread, was a phrase in Latin, "Lux intus est." The light is within. And yet, there was no light, only shadows. The constable in charge, a sharp but excitable man named Talbot, seemed convinced it was a robbery gone wrong. He was probably attacked by some vagrant. Confessionals are open. Makes for an easy hiding spot. Father Brown did not answer. He was staring at the statue of the Virgin near the door, its eyes cast downward, yet today it felt like they were watching. That afternoon, a young woman approached him outside the chapel. Her coat was too thin for the weather, and her gloves were torn, as if she'd been clawing at something she couldn't reach. "You don't remember me," she said, "but you were there the night she died." Father Brown's mind, trained to remember everything and yet speak of nothing, did not react. "My sister Lydia, last year, the river." Her voice was brittle. "Everyone said she jumped." He remembered now. The girl with the pale hair and empty eyes, pulled from the current. No note, no motive. Just water and silence. "I don't think she meant to die," the woman continued, "but someone wanted her gone. And I think she told someone something in confession. Something dangerous." Father Brown tilted his head. "You believe she confessed to Father Mallory?" She hesitated. "No. I think she confessed to someone else, pretending to be him." That was the first fracture in the narrative, and once it cracked, nothing would hold. Because there had been no record of Lydia's confession, no time slot, no candle lit in her name. But someone knew something. Someone had used the veil of the booth to extract the truth, and then ensure it could never be spoken again. The police dismissed it. Suicide, they said. Again, no connection to yesterday's murder. No evidence tying either death to any other. But Father Brown saw patterns in stillness, in omissions, in the things no one ever thought to say. And what he noticed now chilled him. Every person who had seen Lydia in her final week had since left the village, all except one. The church's groundskeeper, a quiet man named Elias, who had once served time for theft, but now kept flowers blooming even in winter. When Father Brown visited Elias that evening, he found the man standing by the old cemetery gate, staring at nothing. "You tend the graves well?" Father Brown offered. Elias nodded, then looked up. "I never spoke to her," he said, without being asked. "But I saw her go into the chapel that night, and I saw someone else leave." "Who?" "That's just it. I couldn't see their face. But they left through the vestry, and they dropped something." He handed it to Father Brown. A rosary, tangled and rusted, its crucifix snapped in half, and on its chain a tiny locket sealed with wax. Father Brown took it back to the rectory and pried it open with a knife. Inside was a photo, blurred but unmistakable. A man and a woman, Lydia, and someone else. Not Elias, not Father Mallory. The man was wearing the church's robes, which made no sense. There was only one other priest at St. Anselm's, and he had been in Italy that month, or so the parish records claimed. Father Brown checked them himself that night. Page after page, name after name, all signed off in the same looping handwriting. Until one line, on the week of Lydia's death, bore a different hand. One that matched the signature on the Latin-embroidered handkerchief. Whoever had confessed to murder before the murder had been impersonating a priest, and no one, not even Father Mallory, had noticed. The next day, Father Brown found his shoes tampered with. Just slightly, the laces tied too tightly, the soles scraped with a blade. A warning. He said nothing to the others, but when he entered the chapel that evening, he found a new note folded beneath the lectern. "You're not supposed to see." She wasn't either. He folded the paper slowly. The air felt heavier now, not with fear, but with memory. Something buried, and now clawing its way out. Later that evening, Talbot informed him they had found a piece of evidence behind the altar, a torn piece of a priest's collar, stained with ink, not blood, but it wasn't cotton, it was paper, disguised, manufactured, deliberate. Whoever had done this had been preparing for months. maybe longer, using the confession booth as a stage, using trust as the weapon, wearing faith like a costume. Father Brown began to see it now, not clearly, but as if through frosted glass. The man in the confessional hadn't been asking forgiveness. He'd been rehearsing. He'd already committed the sin. He was just waiting for the performance to begin. And if that was true, then there would be another act. The final line of the note in his hand read, "Next time, the lie will kneel." He looked up at the statue of Christ, the eyes carved to look skyward, as though even heaven didn't want to witness what was coming next. That night, the chapel door was left unlocked, and someone entered. But when Father Brown turned to face them, there was no one there, only the sound of breathing behind the curtain, the same confessional, and a whisper, "Bless me, Father, for what comes next will damn us both." Father Brown closed his eyes. "I know who did it," he said to no one, "but the truth will never be told." Chapter 2. He spoke lies to God. He confessed with tears in his eyes, but the voice on the other side of the screen wasn't a priest, and the man was already dead. The rain had soaked the village for 3 days straight, hammering on the rooftops like a curse. In Kembleford, people spoke of the weather like it carried a message, an omen perhaps, and maybe it did, because on the 4th morning, the doors of the church opened not to prayer, but to accusation. A man, young, wild-eyed, and barefoot, stumbled into the sanctuary screaming, "He heard my confession, and he lied. He lied to God." He collapsed at the altar, shivering with mud on his hands and something far darker in his eyes. When the constables came to drag him away, he muttered it again, softer this time, but with the weight of something irreversible. Father Brown stood silently behind the pews, watching, listening. And as the man was taken away, he noticed something everyone else missed. Clutched in the man's fist, nearly crushed and smeared with blood, was a piece of cloth, the corner of a priest's stole, torn and stained. Later that day, Father Brown visited the man in the local asylum, where the doctors had already written him off as mad. He didn't speak at first, just stared out the window at the heavy clouds as if waiting for them to fall again. "They said I murdered him," he said finally, "but I didn't. I only told him the truth." "Who?" Father Brown asked. The man's lip trembled. "The priest. The one in the booth." "But no priest has died," Father Brown replied gently. The man blinked. Then why was his neck broken? That sentence, so quiet and casual, cracked the world wide open. There had been no body reported, no official death, no funeral. But Father Brown had learned long ago that truth did not wait for permission. It leaked through the cracks. So he returned to St. Anselm's that night, moving through the shadows of the church, searching for something the daylight couldn't see. In the confessional, everything appeared untouched, but when he stepped inside, the air was colder than the rest of the church. And on the inner wood of the booth, someone had carved a single phrase, barely visible unless you were kneeling. "Dominus non audet mendaces." The Lord does not hear liars. He traced the words with one gloved finger, then paused. There, at the seam between the paneling, was something wedged, a button, ornate, gilded, with ecclesiastical thread, not standard vestment wear. It belonged to one person, Father Gregory Hawthorne. But Father Hawthorne had left the parish months ago. No note, no goodbye, just gone. Unless he never left. The next morning, Father Brown went to the bishop's office to request access to Hawthorne's files. He was met with polite deflection. Transferred to London, they said. Special assignment. But something was wrong. Hawthorne's last sermon had spoken of doubt, of shadows in the soul, and he had not been seen since. Father Brown walked the long hallway of the diocese that afternoon and passed an archivist, Miss Dearden, who looked up at him once, hesitated, then slipped a folded page into his hand without a word. When he opened it in the chapel later that night, he found a copy of Hawthorne's last confession log. The final entry was incomplete. It ended mid-sentence. He says he knows about Lydia. He says he saw me. That was it. Lydia. The same girl from the river. The girl who never spoke again. The pattern was no longer a pattern. It was a noose. 3 confessions. 3 vanishings. All within 6 weeks. All to the same priest. And now, the man who confessed had screamed that the priest lied. Lied to God. What did that mean? Father Brown stood at the altar that night, staring at the crucifix. What truth, he whispered, was so terrible that it had to be buried in lies? At that moment, something shifted behind him. He turned. Nothing. But the candle on the 4th pew had extinguished itself. He walked toward it, slow, deliberate. There, tucked beneath the seat, was another cloth scrap. This one embroidered with a different Latin phrase, Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. And beneath it was a tooth, human, old, filed flat at the top, as if worn down unnaturally. This was no longer about a single confession. This was about something older, darker. Father Brown spent the next day in the seminary records. He found mention of a scandal 30 years earlier. A young seminarian dismissed for preaching heretical interpretations of confession. He believed that the booth was not a place of penance, but a battlefield of control, that a priest could shape a sinner's truth, not receive it. The seminarian's name? Gregory Hawthorne, and he had returned to the priesthood under a different order, quietly, privately, until he arrived at St. Anselm's, where 3 people came to him with secrets and vanished. And now 1 man had seen him, had confessed to him, and claimed the priest lied. Father Brown wasn't sure what disturbed him more, that a priest had twisted confession into manipulation, or that someone had wanted it that way. He returned to the asylum. The man, James, was lucid now, clearer than before. I told him everything, he said, about Lydia, about what I saw in the vestry, about the man with no reflection. Father Brown blinked. No reflection. James nodded. He stood in front of the mirror, but it didn't show him. Just the booth, empty. You saw this where? James's eyes flicked toward the corner of the room. In the dream I had. The night after I confessed, and when I woke up, there was blood under my fingernails. Father Brown left, shaken, not by superstition, but by the weight of symbolism. The mirror, the absence, the blood. Who had James seen? Or, more terrifying, who had seen James? That night, Father Brown didn't go home. He waited inside the church, hiding near the nave, beneath the shadow of St. Michael's statue. At midnight, the confessional door creaked open. Footsteps, slow, careful. A man stepped inside, not James, not Elias, not anyone Father Brown recognized. He wore the robes of a priest, but not any priest alive today. The garments were wrong, too old, stitched by hand. And as the man knelt, he whispered a single phrase. Forgive me, Father, for I do not regret. Father Brown stepped forward. The man did not turn. He simply vanished. Gone. No movement. No door. Just gone. And on the seat where he knelt was a single word etched into the wood. Truth. That was when Father Brown knew this was not a case. It was a trap. And it had been waiting for someone like him to open the door. He stared into the confessional, empty, but only in appearance. There was something inside that booth, something not written in police reports, not spoken by witnesses, not remembered by anyone who walked out alive. Because perhaps they never had, Father Brown did not sleep that night. He sat in the pew until morning, praying for clarity, but none came, only the sound of wind through the broken, stained glass, and the faint scent of blood on the wood. He didn't tell the bishop. He didn't tell the police. He simply closed the church for restoration and sealed the confessional shut with nails blessed by fire. They asked him later why. He only said, because he spoke lies to God. And sometimes God listens, but doesn't forgive. And now that the door is shut, something else is knocking. And Father Brown knows who did it. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 3. The widow didn't shed tears. She served tea to the men carrying her husband's coffin. And not once did she ask what killed him. The village of Kembleford had buried many men, but none like Charles Mallory. Wealthy, respected, a generous benefactor to the church, and known for his charitable acts. And yet, as his casket passed through the chapel aisle, oak and solemn, every eye flicked not to the altar, but to the woman in black, seated in the front row. Eleanor Mallory, his wife, his widow, and the only one in the church who hadn't cried. Not a single tear, not when the priest invoked the psalm, not when the choir sang the final hymn, and not when the coffin was lowered into the ground with the same gravity that had once governed her husband's stern walk. Her hands were folded, her eyes dry, her lips slightly curved, as if caught in some secret thought. It wasn't grief, it was calculation. Father Brown noticed it. He noticed everything, but he said nothing until the evening when he visited her home under the polite pretense of offering prayer. She welcomed him inside with a calm grace that disturbed him more than the death itself. There was no mourning veil, no trembling hands. She poured his tea with a steadiness that made his heart quicken, not with fear, but with recognition. He'd seen this before, not in the faces of the grieving, but in the eyes of those who'd survived by controlling every part of the story. "I assume you're here to ask me what I think happened to Charles," she said, before he'd spoken a word. "I was simply hoping to bring you peace." She smiled, faint, unreadable. "Peace isn't something one waits for, Father. It's something one creates." He looked at her fingers as they wrapped around the cup. No trembling, no tension, but there was something odd, a faint line of irritation on the ring finger, as if a ring had been removed after many years, and recently. "I must ask," he said softly. "Were you with him when he collapsed?" "No," she replied. "I was upstairs." "Yet you heard him fall?" "I heard silence." She looked up. "And silence is often louder than noise." That sentence stayed with him as he walked home. There had been no autopsy. The death had been declared natural, heart failure, but no one had questioned it. Why would they? Charles was in his 60s, worked too much, and slept too little. But something about the widow's composure clashed violently with the supposed shock of her husband's death. The next day, Father Brown visited the coroner. Dr. Halverson, who'd signed off on the death certificate, was a careful man, old, meticulous, and not easily rushed. But when asked about the examination, his voice grew cautious. There was no reason to doubt it, he said. No signs of struggle, no obvious trauma. I examined the body out of courtesy, not suspicion. Did you examine the mouth? The doctor blinked. What? His tongue? His gums? Anything unusual? Dr. Halverson paused. There was some discoloration, but I took it for circulatory failure. Or poisoning, Father Brown asked quietly. That word hung in the air like incense. Dangerous, heavy, undeniable. That night, he returned to the church. As he passed by the confessional, he noticed something odd. A faint smear on the wood. Lipstick. Not recent, but not old either. Strange. Charles Mallory had not confessed in years. He'd once told Father Brown that men of business could not afford the luxury of guilt. And yet, someone had been here. Someone who wore crimson. He entered the booth and sat silently for a moment. Then he opened the small drawer beneath the kneeler. Inside was a scrap of silk, black, delicate, torn, and a scent still clung to it. Lavender, and something sharper, metallic, perfume, mixed with blood. The following morning, Father Brown paid a visit to a house woman few in the village acknowledged but all knew of, Delilah Green. She ran the apothecary on the edge of town, clever, sharp-tongued, and rumored to mix more than cough syrup. When asked if anyone had purchased cyanide or belladonna in recent months, she raised an eyebrow. Those aren't things you just hand out, Father. Even I have standards. I don't need a name, he said. Only a clue. She considered him, then pulled out a small glass vial from under the counter. Someone asked for something that mimics heart failure, said it was for rats, but the dosage they requested was peculiar. Was it a man? No. Woman. Gloved. Paid in coin. He nodded. Later that afternoon, he visited the cemetery. Charles's grave was fresh, the soil unsettled, and there, beside the stone, someone had left a single lily, white, pure, a symbol of renewal, or perhaps regret. But what chilled him wasn't the flower. It was the indentation beside it, as if someone had knelt, not once, repeatedly, as if confessing. That evening, as the village settled into quiet, Father Brown heard a knock at the rectory door. It was the housekeeper of the Mallory estate, Mrs. Gibbons, pale, shaking. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, but you need to know. She's burning the letters. What letters? His, Charles's, the ones he kept hidden in the bureau. She found them last night and started throwing them in the fire. Did you read them? Only one. It was from someone named L. He felt it then, the shape of the secret. Not clear yet, but rising like smoke behind a veil. He thanked her and walked back to the church. At midnight, the wind picked up. As he sat alone in the nave, a door creaked open, and she entered, Eleanor, dressed not in mourning, but in grey. I thought you might be here, she said. You burned the letters. She did not deny it. You killed him. She looked at him evenly. If I did, do you believe I'd tell you here? He looked into her eyes. No, he said, but I believe you told someone. Her mouth twitched. There's something you don't know, she said. Something you'll never prove. Because the truth doesn't live in facts, Father. It lives in silence. And then she handed him something, a photo, of Charles, smiling, beside a woman, not Eleanor, a woman with pale hair. The photo was dated 2 months ago, taken in France. Charles had not traveled recently, according to everyone, except he had, and he hadn't gone alone. The next day, Father Brown received a package. No return address. Inside was a rosary and a note. The widow didn't shed tears because she'd already buried him once. He looked up at the sky, then at the grave, then at the photo, then at the church, and said quietly, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 4. A candle flickered before death. The candle in the chapel was never supposed to go out, but when it did, the woman seated beneath it stopped breathing, and her pulse vanished like the flame. The church was quiet that night, quieter than it should have been, the sort of quiet that doesn't bring peace, but dread. Father Brown had always trusted the stillness of God's house, but something in the air felt wrong, as if the silence itself were listening. It began with a small gust of wind, unnatural, despite the closed doors and sealed windows. It kissed the flame of the sanctuary candle, the one that was supposed to burn eternal, and for a split second the light stuttered, flickered once, then twice, and died. 3 seconds later, Evelyn Harrow, seated beneath the altar rail with her rosary coiled in white-knuckled fingers, collapsed to the floor, eyes wide open and mouth ajar. Dead. No sound, no warning, no struggle. Father Brown ran to her side and felt for her pulse, but her wrist was cold. Her last breath had vanished into the same air that extinguished the flame, and for a long, dreadful moment, the chapel stood in darkness, lit only by moonlight bent through stained glass, washing her still face in a kaleidoscope of saints and sinners. It wasn't her death that frightened him. It was the precision. She had come into the chapel alone, just after evening mass. She had stayed behind while others drifted into the rain. And now, she was gone. There was no noise, no movement, no scream, just that flicker, that faint, final tremble of light. And something about it felt orchestrated. The constables arrived and declared it a heart attack. Natural causes, no marks, no struggle, no poison, they said. Just bad luck. A woman past her prime, overburdened with grief, who had come to pray and left the world instead. But Father Brown didn't believe in luck. Not when it was this quiet. Not when the eternal candle, the one that hadn't gone out in 5 years, failed on the exact moment she died. He lit the candle again, with shaking hands, and watched the flame crawl back to life. Then he noticed something strange. The wax had pooled unevenly, not from time, but from interference, as if someone had tilted it just before it went out, as if someone wanted it to extinguish. That night, he sat at the altar for hours, replaying the scene over and over in his head. Evelyn Harrow, 52, widow, retired schoolmistress, a woman of deep devotion but few friends. She attended every mass, spoke rarely, and wore gloves, even in the summer. The kind of woman people forget to remember, until she dies mysteriously in a locked church beneath a candle that was supposed to burn forever. But something else came back to him. Something Evelyn said last week in the confessional. Her voice was quiet, but he remembered it clearly. "I fear what I saw, Father. Wasn't meant for me to witness, and I think someone knows." He had pressed her gently, asked what she meant. She shook her head, then whispered, "Sometimes the sins aren't spoken in the booth. They're written on faces, and sometimes the face forgets it's being watched." He hadn't asked more. It was her choice not to confess. But now, that flickering light felt like more than a symbol. It felt like a warning. He began asking questions the next day. carefully, quietly, at the grocer's, at the post office. He wanted to know who had spoken to Evelyn recently and what they had spoken about. Most said she kept to herself. One said she had seemed frightened. Another, Mrs. Pennell, a florist, said Evelyn had been in just last week ordering lilies for someone's grave. But no one in Evelyn's family had recently died. When Father Brown asked for the name she gave, Mrs. Pennell furrowed her brow. She said it was for someone named Lucia. That name mean anything to you? Lucia. The name slammed through his memory like thunder. Lucia was Evelyn Harrow's only daughter. Dead 20 years. Drowned in the weir. An accident, they had said. She was 16. Why would Evelyn be ordering fresh flowers for her daughter's grave now, of all times? He went to the graveyard that evening. Rain still in the air. A strange warmth that clung to his collar. Lucia Harrow's headstone was modest, cracked at the base, but freshly cleaned, and beneath the stone, tucked where only someone kneeling might find it, was a note. Folded, damp. He peeled it open, and it read, "It wasn't the water that killed her. It was the secret." There was no signature. He went back to the chapel and stared at the candle again. The flame danced gently, innocent, as if it hadn't extinguished itself the night before. Something Evelyn knew had returned, some memory she couldn't bury. He began to read through old police reports. Lucia's death had been a local tragedy. Beloved schoolgirl. Slipped on the embankment. No signs of foul play. But one sentence caught his eye. Witness was found unconscious near the weir. The name, Henry Vale. Now retired. Living alone. A man who had once been custodian of the parish grounds. Father Brown visited him the next morning. Henry opened the door in a robe, his eyes clouded with the fog of too much whiskey and not enough peace. When Father Brown asked about the night Lucia died, Henry froze. "That was years ago," he muttered. "Why stir it now?" "Because Evelyn Harrow just died," Father Brown said, "and a candle went out when she did." That made Henry look up. "She said something in confession," Father Brown continued. "She remembered a face." Henry shook his head. "She shouldn't have. It was meant to stay buried." "What was?" Henry's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. He didn't answer, just said, "If she died in the church, it wasn't an accident." Later that day, the chapel was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but the candle, the one that had flickered before Evelyn's death, was gone. Just gone. And in its place, beneath the altar, someone had drawn a shape in chalk, a circle, with a name in the center, Lucia. The next morning, a package arrived at the rectory. No return address. Inside, a cassette tape and a note. "Play this at midnight. Only once." He waited. The tape hissed for a moment, then a voice. Evelyn's. "He thought I didn't see him, but I saw. I saw what he did with the robe. I saw the candle go out. I saw her face before she fell. And now, I think he knows I never forgot." Another voice. Male. "Do you want to die with this truth, Evelyn?" Then static. He played it twice, then locked it away. That night, he knelt in the church alone. The lights dim. Rain ticking on the stained glass. And for the second time that week, the candle flickered, then went out. But this time, no one died. Instead, there was a voice from the shadows behind the altar. She wasn't supposed to speak, it said. He turned. A figure, not a ghost. Flesh, and in his hand, a match. "I know who you are," Father Brown said calmly. The man smiled. "Then you also know the truth won't save anyone. It never has. Perhaps, Father Brown whispered, but it might damn someone. The man stepped forward. Only if you tell them. He walked out, leaving behind only the match, and Father Brown stared at it for a long, long time, then said aloud to the flickering dark, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 5. His alibi was too perfect. He was seen at the inn, playing chess with 3 witnesses, but one of them had died 6 hours before the game ever started. The village swore by Harold Finch's innocence. A gentle man with a steady voice, respected by the choir, often seen collecting for the parish and never known to raise it above a whisper. But when Eleanor Tilling was found strangled in her garden, her eyes wide open, her mouth half-shaped into a silent scream, it was Harold's name that slipped off her dying lips. Or so claimed the neighbor, who heard the gasp through the hedge and reported it in breathless panic. The constables arrived quickly. The scene was too clean. No signs of a break-in, no struggle in the flower bed. Just Eleanor, face up in the lavender, and a single glove clenched in her left hand. A man's glove. Soft leather, too small for most, but just Harold's size. Still, the town defended him with religious fervor. He had been at the Hutton Queen's Feather Inn the entire evening between 6 and 10, with witnesses, playing chess, laughing even, and those who sat beside him swore to the timeline. But when Father Brown heard the name of one of those witnesses, Roger Belton, his heart stopped, because Roger Belton had died that afternoon, slipped on the stairwell of his home. Death confirmed at 3:17 p.m. But Harold claimed to have played with him at 7:30. The timeline was impossible, but the certainty of Harold's alibi was terrifying in its precision. So perfect. It broke logic, and that's what made it dangerous. Father Brown began to ask questions, quietly, methodically. Why would 3 people lie for Harold Finch? What did he have on them? Or what had he done for them? The barkeep confirmed all 3 had arrived together, sat together, ordered together. The receipts matched. The board had been set up, but when asked who moved which piece, no one could agree. One said Harold played white, another swore it was black, and the third remembered no game at all, just conversation. That was the first tier in the narrative, a memory too precise around Harold and too foggy around everyone else. Father Brown visited the late Roger Belton's home. His widow greeted him with a dull expression and swollen eyes. Grief clung to her like fog. I didn't expect visitors, she said. I won't stay long. I only need to ask. Was Roger meant to be at the Queen's Feather that night? She blinked. He was meant to be home. Was he a friend of Harold's? Her eyes narrowed. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Not since the accident. What accident? She hesitated. Our daughter, Claire. Her voice cracked. She took her life. In her note, she mentioned Harold, said he promised something, then betrayed it. That name, Claire, the same girl Father Brown had buried the year before. No one knew why she'd done it. She had been quiet, but kind, a music student, gentle. But now Harold's name echoed backward through more than one grave. When Father Brown left the house, he passed a hedge cut low, revealing a bench near the garden, the same bench from which the neighbor claimed to hear Eleanor's last breath. And there, beneath the slats, he noticed something, a fragment of paper, torn from a page. He unfolded it. He promised to meet me at sunset. If I'm not here after, then know he lied again. No name, But the handwriting was feminine, slanted, elegant, Claire's. But the paper wasn't weathered, not a year old, recent. Father Brown brought it to the rectory and matched it against the letters Claire's mother had shared from last year's funeral. The ink was identical, the style unmistakable. But how? How had a year-old suicide note fragment ended up beneath a bench where Eleanor had died just days ago? Unless someone had planted it, or someone had been keeping her words hidden. Until now, that night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. He sat alone in the pew, wrestling with the question that gnawed at him. How do you build a lie so perfect it becomes truth? He had always believed in the confessional, not because it absolved, but because it revealed. So he waited. At midnight, someone entered. Not Harold, but the third man from the inn. Mr. Kellings. He walked slowly, then knelt. "I've never done this," he whispered, "but I'm afraid." "Of what?" Father Brown asked gently. "Of what I saw, and what I agreed to forget." Father Brown leaned closer. "He told us what to say," Kellings said. "Told us to say we saw Roger, that he played white, that he smiled. He even gave us the phrases to repeat, like lines in a play. Why? Because he knew we owed him." "For what?" Kellings didn't answer. He only stood and left something in Father Brown's hand. A photograph of Claire, standing beside Harold Finch, smiling. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and behind them, on the mantel, was a chessboard, with the exact same setup the men had claimed from the inn. That was when Father Brown understood. The alibi wasn't built in a day. It had been rehearsed for years. And the crime wasn't the murder of Eleanor, it was the murder of truth. He returned to the Queen's Feather and spoke to the barkeep again. "Did Harold ever come here with Claire?" The man looked uncomfortable. "Once, maybe twice." "She cried. He drank, didn't stay long." "Do you remember the date?" "March 14th, last year. The day before Claire died." He checked the ledger again. Harold had been at the inn. The same night Claire was found in her room. A perfect alibi again. The same pattern. He was always somewhere else. With witnesses. With receipts. With stories. But too perfect. Always too perfect. When Father Brown returned to the church, he found a letter waiting on the altar. No envelope. Just his name. Inside, in careful cursive, "I'm not a killer, Father. I'm a redeemer. They broke their promises. I merely collected the debt. She chose death. I offered grace, and now Eleanor has joined the silence. You too should be careful what you hear. Not all truth deserves light." No signature, but Father Brown knew the hand, and he knew the lie. The problem was, no one else would believe it, because Harold's alibi was too perfect, and the only ones who could unravel it were already buried. He lit a candle, then whispered to the dark, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 6. She hid truth behind hymns. She sang the hymn so beautifully at the funeral that no one noticed she was mouthing the wrong words, until Father Brown realized those silent syllables spelled out a confession. The church was packed that morning, not because the dead man was beloved, he wasn't, but because the manner of his death was so strange, so violent, so completely unlike anything the village of Kembleford had seen in decades. Albert Greaves had been found in the rectory. Well, eyes open, mouth filled with ash, no note, no witnesses, and yet everyone knew someone had wanted him gone. He had enemies, and most of them were in that church. The choir stood stiff in their robes, white collars tight at the throat. But one of them, the youngest, barely in her 20s, sang with such clarity, such innocence, it almost brought tears to the eyes. Her name was Lydia Fern. She'd joined the choir only 3 months earlier, and in that short time had become a quiet favorite of the parish. Her voice had purity, her face angelic, but something was wrong. Father Brown felt it the moment the hymn began. He wasn't watching the casket. He was watching her lips. The sound came through pure and flawless, but her lips were not forming the words of "Abide with me." They were moving faster, looser, almost disconnected from the tune, as if her voice were on one track and her mouth on another. And in those moments, Father Brown saw a rhythm, not musical, coded. At first he doubted it, thought his mind was playing tricks, but as the second verse began, the pattern intensified. She was mouthing something entirely different, word for word, in silent speech, behind the veil of the hymn. And no one noticed, no one but him. Later that evening, he reviewed the hymn again, playing a recording from the service. He slowed it down, paused on her face, and watched her lips. The syllables became clearer. The message slowly formed. He found the letter. He knew. I hid it behind Psalm 43. He stopped breathing for a moment. What letter? And who was he? Father Brown hadn't known Lydia was close to Albert Greaves. In fact, she'd barely been mentioned in the investigation. But now there was a whisper behind a hymn, buried under grace notes that suggested she had something to hide. The next day, Father Brown went to the vestry and pulled out the old hymnals. Psalm 43. Vindicate me, O God. He opened the page. There was nothing. He flipped through the spine, tapped it for loose inserts. Still nothing, until he noticed it. A tiny slit, made in the fold of the binding. Inside, a sheet of onion skin paper. He slid it out with gloved fingers. It was a letter, half burnt, written in furious strokes. You think I won't tell, but I have to. You made me part of it. I see her every night when I close my eyes. If you don't confess, I will. No signature. But something about the style felt masculine, rushed, terrified. He took it to the constables. They said it was nothing. Probably an old draft, they said. Nothing to link it to Lydia. But Father Brown wasn't done. He approached her after choir practice. She smiled, nervous, too much so. I wanted to commend your voice, he said. It carries truth. Thank you, Father. But it was your lips that told the real story. She froze. Her face went pale. I don't understand, she whispered. Oh, I think you do. She didn't run, didn't speak, just looked away, her mouth pressed shut, and walked straight to the chapel door. That evening, he found another note, pinned to the back of the altar curtain, in the same handwriting as the silent hymn. He said, I'd be saved, but she wasn't, and now I see her in every flame. Who was she? He dug into Albert Greaves's past, quietly, unofficially. 10 years ago, before he returned to the priesthood, Albert had been in a different town, Derbyshire. There had been a scandal, a fire, a girl, Lydia's sister, dead. No investigation, no inquiry, just a relocation, a silence that thickened around his name like smoke. Father Brown returned to Lydia again. He asked gently, Was she your sister? She didn't speak, just nodded, then said, He said it wasn't his fault, that the candle tipped that she shouldn't have been alone. But she wasn't. Alone, was she? Her eyes filled, but not with tears, with rage. He was supposed to watch us. Father Brown understood. Then, the fire, the guilt, the silence, and now, the death. Greaves had finally read the letter, discovered that Lydia knew, and maybe he went to confront her, or maybe she went to him. Either way, he ended up in the well. That night, as Father Brown sat in the dark, staring at the candlelight in the chapel, a strange sound reached his ears. A voice, soft, melodic. Lydia, alone in the pews, singing a hymn to herself. But the words weren't the ones in the book. They were confessions, each note a syllable of guilt, each verse another buried truth. And as the song rose, so did the chill in the air, because the final line wasn't in Latin, it wasn't even in tune. It was a whisper. I didn't push him, I just let him fall. Then silence. Father Brown rose to speak, but she was already gone, leaving only the hymn book behind, and inside another note. This is the last song I'll ever sing, because truth doesn't live in melody, it lives in memory. He lit a candle and stared at the flame, then whispered to no one, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 7. The cross witnessed everything that night. They said the chapel was empty when he died, but when Father Brown examined the crucifix above the altar, he found blood on the underside of Christ's hand, and no one could explain how it got there. Rain struck the roof of St. Jude's Chapel in hard, deliberate taps like a warning in Morse code. It was just past midnight when Martin Coyle was found, crumpled beneath the altar steps, neck twisted, eyes wide open toward the vaulted ceiling, as if he'd died trying to speak to something far above. The police were quick to call it a fall, an accident, a tragic slip after locking up. But the chapel was small, the floor dry, and Martin wasn't old or careless. He was the caretaker. No one knew those steps better. And something else was wrong. His left shoe was missing, his fingernails torn, and clutched in one hand was a small scrap of white cloth, part of a priest's robe, ripped violently. The constables didn't notice the blood, but Father Brown did. He saw it when he knelt beneath the altar for his morning prayer, a dark smear, thin, precise, on the underside of the crucifix's wooden hand. Not a drop, not a spatter, a single drag mark, like someone had reached up in agony or in guilt. And the thing about the chapel's crucifix was this. It hung 12 feet above the floor. No ladder, no stool, no scaffolding. There was no way for anyone to touch that hand unless they were lifted, or unless someone, or something, had already been there, watching. He didn't speak of it right away. He only stared. At the figure of Christ, at the trail of blood, at the impossible placement, and something deep inside him shifted. This was no ordinary crime. This was a performance, an offering. He began asking quiet questions around the village. Who had seen Martin that evening? What was he doing before the church was locked? No one had answers. Only one person remembered seeing him at all. Agnes Milner, the spinster who lived across from the chapel. She said she saw him leave the building around 8, but she remembered it, not because of the time, but because he had a bag with him, not a work bag, a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Like a gift, she said, or a burden. Father Brown walked back to the chapel that afternoon, replaying her words. A gift, a burden. The cross had been clean at Vespers. He had seen it himself. That meant the blood appeared sometime after dusk, and that meant whoever had left it knew what they were doing. He climbed the narrow staircase to the belfry above the chapel. It was dark, dusty. No one had been up there in years, but he saw something strange. A candle, burnt low, and a series of small wax pools scattered along the edge of the balcony that overlooked the altar. A strange place to pray or to watch. Then he found it. Another cloth, white, stained red, stuffed beneath the floorboard, as if hidden in panic. On it, embroidered initials, FC. There was only one priest in the area with those initials, Father Calder. But Father Calder had died last winter, or so everyone believed. That night, Father Brown visited the diocese archives. Quietly, he flipped through records, death certificates, burial logs. He found the notice of Calder's death, heart failure, but no funeral had been held in the parish, and no one remembered seeing a body. He returned to St. Jude's and opened the old guest registry. The page for last December was torn out. The same month Calder was said to have died. Something was being buried, not in earth, but in paper, in silence. The next morning, a child came to the rectory. A girl no older than 10, pale-faced, holding something wrapped in newspaper. "I found this behind the altar," she said. Inside the paper was a rosary, one bead cracked, the crucifix bent, and carved into the back of the metal was a date. 3 days ago, the night Martin died. But the rosary wasn't his. He didn't wear one. That evening, Father Brown returned to the crucifix. He stood beneath it, studied it, then climbed a ladder borrowed from the groundskeeper. And when he reached the hand, he saw something else, etched into the base of the palm, so faint it could have been mist. "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" But this wasn't part of the original carving. It had been scratched in recently, and with the blood, there were fingerprints. Small, delicate, not Martin's, feminine. Someone had been there. Someone who knew Martin would die, or someone who came afterward and watched. He questioned Agnes again, asked if she saw anyone else enter or leave. She hesitated. "There was a woman," she finally said. "I couldn't see her face. Hooded, she moved like she was trying not to make a sound. I assumed it was Sister Helena." But Sister Helena had been in Bristol that weekend. So who had entered the church after hours, and what did they leave behind? The next day, someone broke into the rectory. Nothing was taken, but the registry book had been torn. The section covering the last week gone, and in its place, a single sheet left on the desk, a page from a Bible, ripped from Matthew 27. The crucifixion, the moment of abandonment. Father Brown read it twice, then flipped it over. On the back, written in red ink, "The cross saw everything." But no one listened. He brought the message to the constables. They dismissed it as a prank, but he knew better, because the handwriting was familiar. He matched it against an old choir ledger. Lydia Fern, the same Lydia who once confessed behind a hymn, the same Lydia who had vanished 3 months ago. No one knew where she went. Until now, she was back, and she had been in that church. Maybe the same night Martin died. Maybe just after, watching from the belfry or beneath the cross. And the blood, not Martin's, her own, an offering, a mark, a witness. That night Father Brown sat in the pew alone. No candle, no hymn, just darkness. Then, from behind the altar curtain, A whisper, not a sound, a presence. He stepped forward, and there, carved into the floor, beneath the crucifix, a message, burned into the wood. I told him the truth. He still chose silence. So the cross spoke for me. And Father Brown knew then. This was not vengeance. This was testimony. Someone had confessed. Someone had begged for redemption. And when it was denied, the silence became a scream. The scream became blood. And the blood became scripture. He looked up at the crucifix, at the wooden eyes, at the stained hand, and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 8. Blood washed down the baptismal. The water in the baptismal font was crystal clear at midnight, but by morning it ran red and the body was gone. No one noticed the change at first. The morning sun filtered gently through the chapel's stained glass, casting soft halos of color onto the stone floor. Parishioners entered for early prayer, nodding politely, murmuring greetings, and then came the scream. Mrs. Dalrymple, the church cleaner, had gone to wipe the baptismal font and found her hands stained scarlet, not with dust or wax, but with blood, thick, fresh, still warm to the touch. By the time Father Brown arrived, a small crowd had gathered in the nave, kept at bay by Constable Harris. The font had been drained, the marble bowl scrubbed, but no one could say who had touched it first. And worse, no one could explain the drag marks on the stone floor, as if something or someone had been pulled from the sanctuary toward the vestry. There was no body, no footprints, but just beneath the font's pedestal, wedged into the groove between the marble base and the floor, was a torn piece of cloth, white linen, stained, embroidered at the edge with a single initial, B. Father Brown's mind raced. Only 2 members of the parish bore that letter prominently: Bethany Charles, the choirmaster's daughter, and Benjamin Hollow, a novice acolyte. Both were young. Both had been in the church the previous night for choir practice, and both, as of that morning, were nowhere to be found. He asked around the village quietly. Neither had returned home. Neither had sent word. Their absence didn't raise alarm at first. Young people, after all, could be spontaneous. But Father Brown had seen too many vanish behind the veil of youthful freedom, and the blood in the font said otherwise. He returned to the chapel that night, alone. Rain tapped the roof in hesitant patterns. The candles on the altar flickered. Low, the font had been covered by cloth, but the scent still lingered. Coppery, sweet, unmistakable. Blood leaves a shadow, even after it's wiped away. He stood beside it and whispered aloud, "Baptism is rebirth. But this is a burial." Then he noticed something the constables had missed. A line of tiny droplets, not blood, but wax, leading away from the font, toward the back pews. He followed them, step by step, and beneath the final bench, just near the hymnals, he found it, a candle stub, burned halfway, bent at the base, and wrapped in paper. He unrolled the note slowly. He said it would cleanse us. He said we'd leave whole, but I only watched her break. No signature. The writing was rough, rushed, the paper torn from the church bulletin. He knew then someone had used the font not to bless, but to destroy. He searched the chapel records, baptisms in the past year, 5 all uneventful, all recorded, but one entry stood out, a recent one, dated only 2 weeks prior. Bethany Charles, not an infant, not a child, a woman in her 20s. Why would she request a baptism now? He asked her father the next day. Mr. Charles was pale, tired. She insisted, he said. Said she needed cleansing, that something had followed her since Derby. Derby. The name rang in Father Brown's mind like a bell. That was the same place from which another parishioner, Martin Coyle, had come before his mysterious death beneath the altar weeks ago. And Derby was also the last known residence of Father Calder, the priest who had supposedly died, but whose blood-stained robe had reappeared in Chapter 7. The circle was tightening, and in its center, the font. Father Brown returned to the church that evening and opened the baptismal register again. Beneath Bethany's name, in a different pen, barely visible, was a scribbled word. Failed. He ran his fingers over it, as if the ink still burned. That night, just after midnight, the doors of the chapel creaked open again. A figure entered. Quiet. Hooded. They didn't see him in the shadows. They approached the font and removed the cloth. They reached in, but found nothing. Then they cried. A soft, fractured sob. Father Brown stepped forward. The hood turned. It was Benjamin. His hands were shaking. She's gone, he whispered. He said the water would save her, but it swallowed her instead. Who said that? Father Brown asked. Benjamin looked up, eyes wild. The priest, he whispered, but not you. The other one, the one with the cold hands. Father Brown felt it then. This wasn't just murder. It was a ritual. Bethany had come to be saved. Someone had convinced her baptism would fix her. But something had gone wrong. Or something had gone exactly as planned. He took Benjamin to the rectory, sat him down. The boy spoke in broken circles. She screamed, he said. Then she stopped, and the water turned red. I didn't know what to do. I ran. I thought if I left, it wouldn't be real. Where did you last see her? In the water. Father Brown returned to the chapel. At the base of the font, behind the marble column, he found it, a scrap of red thread, the edge of Bethany's choir robe, and beneath it, something else, a rosary, shattered, missing its cross, and in the place where the crucifix should have hung, there was a lock of hair, tied, knotted, bound. He brought it to the authorities. They said it proved nothing. There was no body, no suspect, no crime. But Father Brown knew the signs. This was not a drowning. It was an offering. He returned once more to the chapel and found, on the altar, a new note, written in red ink. The blood is gone. But the voice remains. She calls from beneath, and the baptism never ended. He lit a candle, watched the flame flicker, then looked down at the font and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 9. The choir boy heard the killer. The boy was deaf in one ear, yet he heard the killer whisper a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in 20 years. The death of Miles Bramley was a tragedy on paper, a respected patron of St. Cecilia's, a donor, a public figure, and to most, a man above reproach. But death rarely arrives for saints, and Miles died wrong. His body was found slumped in the front pew of the chapel just after midnight, eyes open, mouth parted as if mid-prayer. A single candle still burned beside him, untouched. No wounds, no signs of struggle, only a smear of black ash across his neck, drawn like a thumbprint, pressed in silence. The constables, ever eager to settle the unease, ruled it heart failure. No autopsy. The man was 74 after all. But Father Brown had noticed something that morning as he entered the church and caught sight of the altar. There, tucked behind the candelabrum, was a hearing aid, small, child-sized, not Miles's. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Henry Cross, the youngest choir boy in the parish, 11 years old, bright as a bell, and completely deaf in his left ear. It had been gifted to him by a distant uncle, one of the few luxuries his family could afford, and Henry never removed it, except now it sat abandoned near a dead man. Father Brown found Henry sitting alone under the tree behind the schoolhouse later that day, knees hugged tight to his chest, eyes locked somewhere far away. "I didn't drop it," Henry said, before Father Brown even spoke. "I believe you." "I heard it," the boy whispered. He didn't elaborate, not at first, but when Father Brown sat beside him and waited, Henry began to speak. "I couldn't sleep. I left rehearsal early, came back to find my hymnal. I was in the vestry when I heard them. Two voices. One was angry, the other calm. Too calm." Father Brown's breath slowed. "What did they say?" "The angry one said, 'You should have burned it.' And the calm one said, 'She wouldn't stay quiet forever.'" Henry swallowed hard. Then there was a sound, like someone dropping a book, and then nothing. And the calm voice? Still there. It said her name. Whose name? The boy looked up. Lillian. The blood left Father Brown's hands. Lillian May, a name erased from the village. 20 years ago, she had been a Sunday school assistant, young, brilliant, and quietly dismissed from the parish after an undisclosed incident. The rumors were ugly. She'd disappeared overnight. Some said she'd eloped. Others whispered she'd been pregnant. But no one had said her name aloud since. Until now. He went back to the vestry, searched through the archives, found nothing on Lillian. Her name had been removed from every ledger, every choir list. Even the photos on the wall had been carefully retrimmed. But there was something no one had thought to check: the donation log. And there it was, 21 years ago. One donation in her name, made on a Sunday following her disappearance. The note beside it read, "For the restoration of silence." He traced the handwriting. It was Miles Bramley's. That night, he returned to the chapel, sat alone in the pew beside where the body had been found. The candle still flickered faintly. He turned to the altar and found another scrap of paper, folded, yellowed. Inside, a letter, unsent, dated 20 years ago. "I told him I couldn't lie for him. I told him the truth would burn through everything if buried. He said he'd handle it, that the church couldn't afford a scandal. But she never came back, and I never heard her scream again." Unsigned. But the penmanship was familiar. It was the same as the current bishop's. Father Brown brought it to the diocese. They denied everything, called it a forgery, said he was seeing ghosts. But that morning, another note appeared in the collection box. She sang once, too, before she choked. And in the envelope, an old necklace, a locket, inside, a photo of Lillian, standing beside Miles. Her eyes were hollow, her hands behind her back, bound. He couldn't tell, but she wasn't smiling. And behind them, in the photo's blurry background, a familiar altar cloth, the same one used only on Easter Sunday, which meant the photo had been taken in the church after she disappeared. He confronted Henry again. The boy said, "One more thing. When the man died, he didn't fall. He knelt, like he knew it was coming. Did he see you?" "No," Henry said, "but the other man did." That stopped Father Brown cold. "Who?" "He wore robes. but not like yours. Older, stained. That night, he searched the old wardrobe in the sacristy, and behind the stitched vestments, he found a hidden compartment. Inside, a folded robe, blood-stained, dry, and, beneath it, a cassette tape. He played it on the rectory's dusty recorder. First static, then a voice. Female. Stop. Please. Don't do this. I won't tell anyone. Then silence. Then a man's voice. You already have. Then a sound. Soft, like a candle being snuffed. And the tape ended. He went to the police. They said it was old, unusable, no proof of identity. Then they asked who else had heard it. He said, only me. He lied, because Henry had already listened, and he wasn't deaf anymore, not in the way that mattered. The next morning, the altar was stripped bare and carved into the wood beneath the cloth. He heard the killer, but no one believed him. Father Brown looked up at the crucifix, then down at the pew, and whispered, I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 10. He died after saying Amen. The moment his lips finished the final Amen, he smiled, and then fell forward onto the altar, eyes open, already dead, and no one could agree on what he had just confessed. There were 16 people in the chapel that evening. The rain outside beat against the windows like a metronome of dread. The lights flickered only once during the prayer. Nothing more. And yet when Gerald Fitch leaned forward to receive the sacrament, whispered a single word to Father Brown that no one else could hear, and uttered his last Amen, something in the room snapped. Not a sound, not a scream, just a shift. And then he collapsed. Chin struck the rail. Blood ran from his mouth, not in a gush, but in a line, quiet and thick, like something ancient had been waiting for its release. He was dead before he hit the floor, and what came next would unravel everything the village thought it knew. Gerald wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't religious. He hadn't taken communion in nearly 30 years. A man known more for debts than prayers, for secrets whispered in alleys and drinks left half-finished on counters. And yet, he'd arrived just before the doors closed. Kneeling in the back, head bowed, a ghost returned to the sanctuary. When the constables arrived, they assumed heart failure. A peaceful death, they called it. He died in church, didn't he? Must have been ready to go, one muttered. But Father Brown knew better. The body didn't lie peacefully. It was rigid, tense, fingers curled like claws toward the crucifix. And the final look on his face, it wasn't serenity, it was triumph. Father Brown remembered the word Gerald whispered to him, the word that came before the Amen. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't scripture. It was a name, Catherine, a name that had not been spoken in Kembleford since the last scandal, the one buried so deep, even the dust avoided it. Catherine Moore, 21, gone missing 15 years ago, last seen in this same church, seated in the fourth pew, waiting for someone who never arrived. It was assumed she ran away. Theories swirled, love affair, money, madness, but nothing stuck, and her name faded, like breath on cold glass, until now. Father Brown began retracing Gerald's steps. Who had he spoken to? Where had he been before arriving at Mass? At the tavern, the barkeep said Gerald had been alone, scribbling something in a notebook. He left before finishing his drink. At the post office, he'd sent a letter. No return address, no name, paid in cash. Father Brown visited the rectory that evening, searching Gerald's seat. Beneath the kneeler, tucked carefully behind the prayer cushion, was a torn envelope. Inside, the first page of a confession. No signature, no date, but it read, like guilt, carved into paper. I buried her where the roots reached the bones, under the floorboards. She said she forgave me, but I saw her eyes when the soil hit her mouth. The handwriting matched old visitor ledgers from years past. Gerald's. No doubt. He brought the letter to the authorities. They hesitated. Too long ago. No body, no proof. And yet, the church smelled different now, as if memory had a scent, and it had begun to rot. The next morning, the baptismal font overflowed. Water, tinged pink, ran across the marble, and beside it, on the floor, someone had etched a cross into the stone, not with reverence, but rage. Deep, crude. Beneath it, in broken Latin, I was not forgiven. Father Brown stood in the chapel and stared at the pew where Catherine used to sit. Then he noticed it. Something small. Something that should not have been there. A button. Brass. Worn. With the crest of the Moore family. A tiny oak leaf. It had been decades since they left the village, but she had been here. Her presence sewn into wood and him. That night, Father Brown couldn't sleep. He opened the floorboards beneath the fourth pew, and beneath the dust and splinters, he found it. Not bones, not cloth, but a ribbon, pink, and stained with something dark. Inside the knot, twisted in the fabric, was a ring, inscribed with one word, Catherine. He didn't bring it to the police. He lit a candle and stared at it all night. Because the truth wasn't just haunting the chapel, it was humming. The choir that Sunday sang with unusual intensity. But when the final hymn closed, Father Brown didn't dismiss the crowd. He stepped forward and laid the ring on the altar. Gasps rose, and one man fainted, because the ring had been missing for 15 years. Because everyone thought it was buried with her, but it hadn't been. It had been hidden, saved, or offered. A woman approached him after the service, old, frail, eyes sharp like winter wind. She said one word, Gerald. Then she handed him something wrapped in cloth. A second letter. Same hand. Same ink. But this one was written to Catherine. If I say Amen loud enough, maybe God will hear it and stop watching. But I know now, nothing is silent under this roof, not even the dead. That night, the altar cloth was torn, and written beneath it, in blood, she heard the Amen, and she answered it. Father Brown stared at the stained stone and whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Chapter 11. She smiled before the funeral. She stood at the foot of the coffin, smiled like she'd won a game, only she knew the rules too. And when asked who she was mourning, she said, not him, the next one. There were 32 mourners inside St. Bartholomew's Chapel that morning. The sky was a dull sheet of grey, the kind that made time feel suspended, as if the hour itself didn't want to move forward. The deceased was Alan Forsyth, a solicitor by trade, respected and feared in equal measure. His death, while unexpected, had raised no suspicion, until the moment Clara Morell arrived, dressed not in black, but in pale lavender. She moved through the church like a memory come to life, smiled faintly at the casket, and mouthed something no one heard, except Father Brown, who stood at the altar and saw her lips form 3 unmistakable words. Now it begins. She hadn't been invited. No one remembered her name. But her face, once pointed out, caused discomfort in the room. A few whispered they'd seen her before, years ago, during another funeral. One no one wanted to recall. And when Father Brown asked her after the service how she knew the deceased, she answered without blinking, "He promised me something, and he took it back. Now, I'm here to watch the debt settle." It should have ended there, a cryptic guest, a stray comment. But when the funeral procession reached the cemetery and the casket was lowered, something impossible happened. The groundskeeper, startled, called out mid-ceremony. He'd found another grave disturbed just meters away. Freshly turned soil. A broken marker. No name, just a date. That date was tomorrow. The constables were called. No body, just an open pit. Deep and ready. As if someone had prepared a second funeral. As if Alan Forsyth wasn't the only one expected to die this week. That night, Father Brown requested access to Alan's private study. He'd been a man of locked drawers and bolted safes, the kind who didn't trust memory alone to protect his secrets. Within the top drawer, beneath estate documents and court papers, was a torn envelope. Inside, a single photograph, sepia-toned, a younger Alan, standing beside a woman in lavender. Clara. On the back, scribbled in urgent ink, "If she returns, tell no one." The next morning, the maid found a note pinned to the chapel door, a hymn torn in half. Across the top, in red ink, someone had written, "She sings for the dead, but listens for the guilty." Father Brown began to ask questions. Quietly, Clara Morell had vanished from public record 22 years ago. Last listed as a music teacher, no known relatives, but buried in old parish archives between choir rosters and sacramental logs was a baptism record. A child. Name blacked out. Mother, Clara. Father, Alan Forsyth. And beside it, in the margin, someone had written, "Stillborn." But something was wrong. The doctor who signed the certificate, Dr. Lyle Cavendish, had been stripped of his license a year later for procedural negligence. And further down in the archives, a second note from the same week. Burial delayed. Mother unfit to attend. No grave was ever recorded. No child ever mourned. Until now, Father Brown returned to the cemetery, walked the perimeter, studied the second grave again. The broken marker wasn't just snapped, it had been replaced. Someone had dug here before, repeatedly, and when he peeled back the wet earth with gloved hands, he found it. The corner of a silk dress. Tiny, child-sized, wrapped around a wooden cross and stitched into the hem in faded pink thread. For Lily. He replaced the soil carefully, returned to the chapel, and there, sitting in the back pew, was Clara, humming a lullaby. The same tune played at the baptism of infants. When he sat beside her, she stopped humming. But she didn't look at him. She only said, "He said she never drew breath, but I heard her cry." "Clara," Father Brown said gently, "what happened?" Her smile returned. "He paid someone to silence her, and when I screamed, they said I was mad. And when I wept, they locked me away. And when I returned, he had forgotten the name of the girl he took from me. Why now? Because it's time someone else said amen." That night, Alan's law partner, Reginald Dawes, was found dead in his study. Poisoned. No sign of a break-in, but beside him, on the desk, a music box, still playing. The same lullaby Clara had hummed. The constables ruled it suicide. Overwork. Grief. Coincidence. But Father Brown saw the note in the wastebasket. She smiled before the funeral, And I knew I was next. He confronted Clara the next day. She was lighting candles in the chapel. "I know you weren't at Alan's funeral for closure," he said. "You were waiting. For justice. Or revenge?" She turned to him, slowly. "Does the word matter if it ends the silence? Did you kill him?" She said nothing, just smiled again and placed one more candle on the altar. Then she handed him a letter, unopened, dated 2 weeks before Alan died, addressed to her, from Reginald Dawes. Inside, a confession. "We lied. We covered it. It was never stillbirth. He paid to make you believe it. She lived for 3 hours, and he said it was easier to let her fade than let you have her." Father Brown held the letter, felt its weight like stone. "I will not stop," Clara said quietly, "until someone says her name." That night, someone broke into the church. They didn't steal. They didn't destroy. They placed a new plaque beneath the altar. It read, "Lillian Morell, 2001 to 2001. And below it, "Beloved, not forgotten." When Father Brown lit the next morning's candles, he saw something carved into the pew where Clara always sat. A single sentence. She smiled before the funeral because it was never her grief. And he whispered, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told. Chapter 12. No one saw him leave. They locked every door, searched every corridor, sealed the vestry from the inside, and still, when the lights came back on, the suspect was gone, and the only thing left behind was the rope he should have been hanged with. It had started like any other Maundy Thursday, solemn and sacred, the chapel filled with candlelight and quiet breath. Father Brown had been asked to remain after the service, not as priest, but as witness. A man had come forward, a man wanted in connection with 3 deaths across 3 parishes, each with whispered links to the church. The diocese had insisted on secrecy. The constables had surrounded the building. The sanctuary was locked, the windows barred, no one in, no one out. And yet, when Father Brown turned from the altar for a brief second to extinguish the final flame, the man vanished. He had been sitting no more than 12 feet away, cuffed, watched, motionless, but when the final candle flickered and darkness swallowed the room, something shifted. A cold gust, a feeling like the chapel itself had held its breath. And then, gone. They searched for hours, every pew, every passage, the bell tower, the crypt. Nothing. No one saw him leave. But someone had helped him disappear. At first, the authorities suspected trickery, an inside job, but the constables were vetted. The doors hadn't moved. There was no secret tunnel, no hidden passage. And the man, Elias Grieve, wasn't a magician. He was a gardener, a quiet figure in a long line of forgotten faces. 3 women, all dead, one from drowning, one from fire, one from a fall that shattered every bone in her body. Each death written off, each death marked by a single red thread, left behind like a signature. And Grieve had been connected to them all, but never formally charged, until now. He had come forward willingly, asking only to speak with Father Brown. And now he was gone. The constables turned on each other, blamed their own shadows. But Father Brown said nothing, because when the lights went out, he had seen something the others hadn't. A face. Not Elias Grieve's, someone else's, watching from the choir loft, unmoving, expressionless, and wearing priest's robes from another century. He didn't tell them that part, not yet. Instead, he returned to the chapel the next night, alone. And on the altar, where the man had last been seated, he found a folded piece of cloth. It wasn't a note. It was a collar, a priest's. Inside the fold, a single slip of paper, 7 words. The faithful always vanish into belief. He took it back to the rectory, stared at it for hours. The handwriting was elegant, familiar. It matched the ledger from chapter 4, the one written by Father Calder. The priest, long thought dead. The next day, someone broke into the chapel, but nothing was stolen, only rearranged. The rope, the one used to secure Elias's wrists, was now tied in a perfect noose, hung on the crucifix above the altar. Below it, a stone had been placed, flat, clean, etched with a date. Tomorrow, no name, no initials. Just the time, 3 a.m. Father Brown didn't alert the police. He waited, sat in the pew all night. When the hour struck, the rope began to sway. There was no wind, no movement, but the noose creaked as if it had borne weight. And from the shadows at the back of the church, a whisper. I never left. He turned, but the pews were empty. Then he heard it again, closer. I never left. I was taken. Father Brown rose, slowly, and walked toward the vestry. Inside, lit only by moonlight leaking through the stained glass, was a figure kneeling. Not Elias, Clara Morell. She was humming, the lullaby from chapter 11. She looked up and said, I saw him. He didn't leave. He was pulled, backward. By whom? She smiled and whispered, the one who never forgives. That morning, the constables returned. They found the chapel empty, except for one thing, a single shoe, Elias's, placed in the center of the sanctuary. And inside it, tucked carefully into the heel, was a tiny, rolled scrap of parchment. On it, he confessed, and then was claimed, because no one leaves unless the church lets them. Father Brown closed the chapel for 7 days. No services, no bells, no light. He sat beneath the crucifix each night, waiting for an answer. It never came, but the noose remained, untouched, and carved into the wood below it. Sometime during the silence, no one saw him leave, because he never did. And Father Brown, trembling, whispered, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told.